Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Will. To me, my X-Men fans, whether it's the movies, the comics, or the TV shows, you know that Cyclops' main powers is the energy blast he produces from his eyes. But what you may not know is how they work, which is what we will be discussing in today's video. Let's get to it. For almost 60 years, Marvel fans have been duking it out over a deceptively simple answer. When Cyclops opens his eyes and a mountain goes down, where exactly is that power coming from? Is it something generated and saved in the body, like a power battery? Or does he literally open a portal to a dimension made of concussive force, affectionately dubbed the Punch Dimension online? It is a good meme, a lot of fun, no denying that, and maybe even a perfect explanation for a hero as such. But it is, based on the comics, only half true, and to be fair, it was the primary official explanation only briefly during the 1980s, before Marvel later revised and combined it with other explanations. Marvel has repeatedly revised, replaced, and sometimes combined these explanations over the years, making the character's powers confusing even for longtime fans. If you go digging around actual comics and Marvel's own handbooks, you'll realize that the real answer has been quietly changing for over 50 years now. So today, we won't be doing any power scaling video. We'll actually be doing something useful, taking note panel by panel and handbook by handbook so we can answer the definitive question: which Cyclops has actually been the established canon of Marvel on paper for 60 years? It's high time to bring clarity about the powers of one of the underrated heroes of the X-Men. So, without further ado, let's get right into it, shall we? The origin of the solar energy explanation and why darkness weakens him. Let me introduce Cyclops to the new ones here first. Scott Summers, aka Cyclops, the first member of the X-Men and a mutant who can fire optic beams from his eyes. As a child, he and his brother Alex had been estranged from their parents after their family's plane was attacked and crashed, after which he had been taken to an orphanage run by the nefarious Mr. Sinister. The geneticist Mr. Sinister became interested in Scott and his potential, because of which Scott was often subjected to a series of experiments and tests. When he successfully manages to escape the orphanage, Professor X takes him under his wing and trains him in his school. He soon proves to be a quality leader, successfully guiding countless missions with various other members of the X-Men. And not that much later, he even becomes the leader of the X-Men. Well, enough of his history now, let's get into the main topic. So, as stated earlier, Cyclops' eyes emit concussive optic blasts. Now, these are forms of pure kinetic force, and the origin of these powers is described in X-Men number 43, published in 1968. It's never been revealed, but the ultimate source of these optic beams is the life-giving sun itself. Scott's piercing brown eyes act as miniature, yet ultra-effective solar batteries, storing up light as do the plants about us. And, in a process not unlike photosynthesis, they convert it into irresistible energy. Simply put, his powers come from absorbing solar energy, which then converts into destructive optic blasts. So he's like an energy manipulator, with solar batteries for eyes. Now, any average X-Men watcher would know that while powerful, Cyclops still has issues controlling his optic blasts, right? Due to this, he has to wear ruby quartz eyewear, a translucent mineral that helps nullify the optic blasts. It blocks the constantly active beams from passing through. Apart from a pair of simple ruby quartz glasses for daily use, he also has a visor with advanced settings to modify the intensity and impact of the blasts, which is used during fights. Its adjustable aperture allows him to vary the width and effective intensity of the beam, from precise shots to broad blasts. Want to know the range? With the help of neutron detectors and powered microchips, Cyclops can expel blasts either the size of a small coin or as huge as mountains. Fascinating, isn't it? However, he doesn't seem to possess an endless source of energy, which becomes apparent now that we know where his abilities are powered from. When away from sunlight for long periods, his energy gets visibly depleted. What happens is that his body involuntarily absorbs ambient energy from his surroundings, which is then stored in the cells of his body. So when this stored energy is utilized for optic blasts, his body gets drained of energy, due to which he has to recharge himself. This means prolonged periods without replenishing ambient energy can gradually deplete his reserves, making darkness a disadvantage over time rather than immediately. A good example appears in Uncanny X-Men Annual number 3, where Storm channels electricity into Cyclops. Scott metabolizes that energy and releases a supercharged optic blast into Archon's machinery, demonstrating that he can replenish or augment his energy reserves using sources other than sunlight. Therefore, his powers are rechargeable and not infinite. And while it is said that his powers come from absorbing solar energy, it is important to point out that Cyclops' I-beams are completely devoid of heat. They are concussive in nature, which do not melt or burn targets per se, but are simple, forceful blasts of energy, capable of tipping over a 5,000-gallon tank at a distance of 20 feet, or even puncture a carbon steel plate at a 2 feet distance. Another example comes from the alternate Age of Apocalypse timeline, where Cyclops blasted off Weapon X's adamantium-laced hand. Since this involved an alternate version of Cyclops, it should not be treated as a standard Earth 616 power feat, so you can understand how powerful he is, right? Now, on the other side of this solar energy explanation lies the fan-favorite theory of a punch dimension, the place where Cyclops' powers, aka his optic blasts, apparently come from. It is another universe filled with particles that produce enormous kinetic energy. Fans later nicknamed it the Punch Dimension. It might be hard to digest, but this explanation was officially introduced in the 1983 official handbook of the Marvel Universe before Marvel later revised it. But then, what about his energy weakening with lack of sunlight? Starting to sound complicated, right? So let's look at what this dimension is all about for some clarity. How the Punch Dimension theory was created and then officially reversed. According to this theory originally put in the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, Cyclops' optic beams are concussive blasts that come from a different realm known as the Punch Dimension. Here, Scott's eyes basically act as interdimensional apertures into another Einsteinian universe, allowing him to use beams however he wants. Although Marvel revised the original 1983 explanation in later handbooks, subsequent reference material combined the solar energy and interdimensional aperture explanations rather than abandoning either one entirely. It was super hard to explain the physics behind this dimension, and it was rarely referenced in the comics. The closest example is Ultimates 2 number 9, which depicts a universe of pure concussive force, but it never explicitly connects that dimension to Cyclops' optic blasts. It was in Al Ewing and Travel Foreman's Ultimates 2 number 9 when American Chavez opens a portal to this dimension, which was filled with a lot of red kinetic energy, which looked a lot similar to that of Cyclops' optic blasts. So yes, the Punch Dimension is a canon thing in the Marvel Universe, but its connection with Cyclops is not shown much. Apart from this, the dimension was never dramatized in an actual Cyclops story. So let's take a look at what Al Ewing had to say about this. The problem is we're not allowed to mention Cyclops' power has dimensional holes to the Punch Dimension. Al Ewing at Thought Bubble Comic Festival. To fix it after the issue in 1983, Marvel released a corrected issue in the 1986 edition of the official handbook, returning to an energy absorption explanation before later reference books combined it with the interdimensional aperture model. After that, in 2004, an attempt was made to merge both ideas, in the sense that Cyclops used the absorbed solar energy to open the portals to the Punch Dimension and then subsequently fires the optic blasts at targets. However, no major Cyclops comic has explicitly adopted the handbook explanation that his optic blasts originate from that dimension. So, on paper, the Punch Dimension sounds like a fun addition to the story, but practically speaking, the comics generally avoid explicitly explaining the mechanism, while the handbooks have revised and combined multiple explanations over the years. To add one last thing before moving on to the next topic is the fact that, while initially Scott would metabolize solar energy by himself, modern Marvel reference books combine the ambient energy explanation with the interdimensional aperture model, rather than replacing one with the other, which apparently is similar to his brothers Havoc and Vulcan. This should not be confused with Havoc and Vulcan's distinct energy manipulation abilities, as the Summers brothers do not all share the same power mechanisms or immunities. This is a separate, later retcon layer distinct from the original 83 handbook claim. What modern comics actually support today. So, which theory do the modern comics actually support in today's time? To understand that, we will have to go through some instances of the comics. To begin with, we have Civil War X-Men number 4 of 2006, where we can see Cyclops overloading Bishop, a character whose core ability is energy absorption in mere seconds. And not only that, but he was able to rip through a bunker built by Iron Man, which was made to contain a nuclear bomb, and is supposedly indestructible. If this isn't a feat that grandly demonstrates the insane energy output Cyclops is capable of, then I don't know what is. The scene demonstrates the magnitude of Cyclops' output, but it doesn't establish whether that energy was produced directly by his cells or released through an interdimensional aperture. What's going on here? I'm reading power levels of 2 gigawatts coming off Bishop. They need to stop. Both of them are going to sustain fatal neurological damage if they keep that up. Iron Man in Civil War, X-Men number 4, talking about Cyclops and Bishop. The next supporting detail is the Summers brothers' immunity. If you've noticed, Cyclops never seems to be affected by the optic blasts, even though they come from his eyes, which are such a sensitive part of anyone's body. Do you know how that's possible? This is possible because of the brothers' mutation. It includes generating a psionic field around them which protects them from their own blasts and attacks. This is also another reason why the brothers themselves are immune to each other's attacks. For instance, when Cyclops kept getting hit by Havoc's blasts all across his body, it never affected him. Marvel's reference material states that Cyclops' body absorbs ambient energy into its cells, rather than only his eyes. Because in another incident, like in Marvel Team-Up 1972 Annual Number 1, Cyclops is seen absorbing intense heat generated from this particular psychic ritual, and then subsequently expels pure energy into space. While this amount of heat took down our Spider-Man and Nightcrawler, it didn't do much to Cyclops at all. So if not for the energy absorption mechanism, then how would Cyclops be able to engage in such actions? Something to think about, definitely. Let's move on to how the mythology around Cyclops' power soon starts shifting. Do you remember how he doesn't have much control over the optic blasts? So let me remind you how it was initially thought by many fans that the inability to control the optic blasts rose from the traumatic head injury he had incurred from the plane crash in his childhood, which resulted in him and his brother becoming estranged from their parents. But later, in Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassidy, it introduced the possibility that Scott's lack of control was partly psychosomatic, arising from childhood trauma, while Marvel's official profiles continue to mention his head injury as a contributing factor. But wait, if you remember what I had mentioned at the beginning of the video, you would agree that even Mr. Sinister was a big reason for his trauma. His incessant experiments and tests on a non-consensual unknowing child must have been scarring. Later stories suggest that Scott's childhood trauma contributed to the development of a psychosomatic block that affected his control over his powers. So his lack of control goes from it being merely physical to it becoming psychological. This shows how the story around Cyclops' power keeps changing. All in all, comics and storylines today support Cyclops having solar-based absorption for producing optic blasts instead of the brief punch dimension theory. The myth around this dimension still runs wild in many fan bases. And of course, it would. It was officially part of the Marvel Handbook at one point. However, in the current times, the talks of this dimension are more meme-like and just a fun concept to talk about with friends, not something considered valid. Although the original 83 handbook explanation was revised in later editions and subsequently combined with the ambient energy explanation in later Marvel reference material. Marvel's indecisiveness is why the fans are still debating about this whole thing even decades later. So, to conclude, let's look at the whole picture. Throughout the comics, the consistent dramatized explanation for Cyclops' power and its origin has been him absorbing solar-based energy and storing it in his cells and utilizing it during battles to convert into concussive forces of optic beams, all of which is externally controlled by his ruby quartz advanced visor. Parallel to this, although the punch dimension does exist in the Marvel Universe, it doesn't seem to hold much connection with Cyclops or his power, and has never been explained in actual comic books yet. This was deemed too difficult to explain practically and has not been used in stories. The myth is real. The contradiction is also true, but the verdict from the comics themselves is solar and kinetic absorption and not punch dimension. That's all for today, folks. I hope this video has made things clear for you, and now you have a better understanding about the whole this or that debate. Let me know your thoughts about Cyclops down in the comments,